Hello, and welcome to People Speaking Rail. We are those people. I am Mike Bowden-Dissel, head of Intermodal Solutions here at FreightWaves, and I'm joined, as always, by Joanna Marsh, my colleague who writes the editorial column at FreightWaves.com. Joanna, you've been busy with all the CP and KCS merger news.
I know it's been pretty crazy with the rail industry lately. You got the merger, got rail safety, you have East Palestine, all sorts of things.
Yeah, it almost seemed like STB did Norfolk Southern a solid by highlighting all of the benefits of rail safety in their write-up of the CP-KCS merger. But that's something that we can get into. So you just put out this article on regulators, Canadian Pacific, Kansas City Southern merger. I think most people have seen that news already. And what was interesting was that it wasn't a unanimous decision where Robert Primus, one of the members of the board, I believe he's one of the democratically appointed members, he dissented, and Robert Primus cited concern about competition, and thought that the pre-2001 rules should have been used instead of, or the newer rules should have been used instead of the older rules. Yeah, this is the article on the site. You go into some detail about that, but he brings up that consolidation has shown this been bad for shippers. The absence of a sort of service assurance plan, was a concern, and then talked about maybe potentially harming communities along the path. That was interesting because the other board members, I guess, approved the deal, and then there were so many sort of mitigation measures in place, including this lengthy, sort of oversight period of 7 years. So what did you gather, from all that? And did you agree with the decision to approve, or were you more on the side of Robert Primus, who voted against it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, it's interesting in the first place, actually, that STB allowed the merger to be considered under the pre-2001 rules, which in general are less stringent. And I guess, the argument was that Kansas City Southern is the smallest Class 1 railroad, and because of its size, even if it is merging with Canadian Pacific, both railroads are the two smallest of the Class 1s. And so even combined, they will still make the smallest Class 1 railroad out of, I guess, the now 6. And so, but I think, so which makes sense, that they approved looking at the merger under that condition. Although at the same time, it is interesting because, you have all these other dynamics in play. Obviously the most recent issue being rail service, over the past year, even though KCS and CP didn't bear the brunt of STB's, I won't say ire, but, sort of scrutiny, the overall, the freight rail industry has been on the defensive in terms of rail service. Although again, actually, Oberman did point out, STB Chairman Marty Oberman did point out that CP and KCS haven't had the rail service issues that the other big 4 Class 1 railroads have had, CSX, Union Pacific, BNSF, and Norfolk Southern. So yeah, so it is interesting to review. To have had go through this merger process, given the rail service issues, given the recent safety issues. STB can only do so much in terms of looking at rail safety, since it's under the purview of the Federal Railroad Administration primarily. But I don't know. The other interesting point I thought was how Oberman said, kind of pointed out the difference in the way that the Surface Transportation Board looks at mergers and acquisitions versus the Department of Justice, and how Congress mandates them to look at these mergers with the intent of do they improve sort of transportation in general. So as opposed to is the merger for the common good versus does it benefit the companies or something? So yeah, it's just I don't know.
Yeah,
It is kind of
it did seem like that with that comment, Marty Oberman was trying to preempt what a lot of senators are likely to say. I mean, you did have Bernie Sanders come out and against the merger. You've had it was the lady from Boston. I can't remember her name.
Elizabeth Warren. Yeah,
Elizabeth Warren,
yeah,
basically makes the argument that anytime big companies come together, that reduces competition. And, I don't think that's true in this case because you have non-overlapping geographies. And the point the STB makes is that if you combine the two smallest railroads, you actually enhance competition because now that larger railroad, which is still the smallest, is a better competitor against the other class one railroads. And I didn't see as much focus in there as I would have expected on the extent of the reach of the railroad network, which I think goes into that concept that this larger railroad now competes better against the others. I mean, you think about things like now it's going to be easier to move U.S. grain export through the port of Vancouver. It's going to be easier to move Canadian grain all the way down to Mexico. So that makes it, Canadian grain more competitive with U.S. grain for consumption in Mexico. It's going to make it easier to move auto parts from, let's say, Detroit area to the assembly plants in Mexico. So I think it extends a lot of this reach, which sort of goes into the other thing that the STB considers. So they basically consider two things. They say, well, it does this enhance or detract from competition, and I think most of them said it enhances it. And then the other part of this goes into is this in the public interest? And that's the point that STB really wanted to drill home to get ahead of maybe a political firestorm is to say that this isn't just like certain other industries merging. You have to look at the traveling public. And it is in the traveling public's interest to have fewer trucks on the road, particularly fewer trucks, hauling hazardous materials, and instead have that volume on the railroad. And then they called out what they thought would be a shift of 64,000 truckloads annually in North America, which I haven't looked at all the detail on exactly how they get to that number, but it does sort of make sense if you can run, intermodal, let's say, in a one network from Chicago to Dallas, for instance. And just all the other types of business too. I mean, I think that's in the public interest. So I think those were really the sort of the two biggest things that caused the merger to be approved. But then there were all these mitigation measures, and you were expecting some mitigation measures. And we can go through those. Might be helpful for folks who haven't read all the detail. But what did you make of the conditions or mitigation measures associated with the deal? And did those go above and beyond sort of your expectations?
yeah. I mean, I think part of it again, it kind of goes back to the rail service issue because it's the mitigation measures include kind of having having a good look at the Chicago area and the Houston area in terms of ensuring that the network is fluid in both regions and because those two regions have been trouble spots and even though I believe in Houston KCS isn't it's really more of the BN and UP's traffic, but but still anyway, that coordination, I think, especially since rail service issues were such a big deal last year. Not to say that they haven't gone away, but because they have been a big deal, I think it it was one of the factors in contributing to that heightened focus in Chicago, which has always historically had sort of that congestion issue, and Houston, and then of course you also have that piece with the even though it's not necessarily directly related to freight rail, the piece about the Chicago suburbs.
Mhm.
Wanting to ensure that that there isn't a lot of disruptions to local traffic occurring because of the additional freight trains that'll be running alongside the Metra commuter rail. And so there's just a lot of data points that STB is going to be requiring, pertaining to Chicago and Houston in terms of ensuring that things run smoothly at both places. And I think some other places as well, as detailed in the over 200-page decision.
Mhm.
But yeah, and that's for starters.
Yeah, which at 200 pages, it's actually less than some other government documents that we look at for
That's
the
true.
railroad industry.
Yeah.
So maybe they're getting a little bit more concise
Yeah.
with their rulings. But yeah, all that stuff is interesting. I mean, Chicago is typically the most congested part of the North American railroad network, so it might be a little bit hard to decipher, if the congestion in Chicago is due to this merger, because it doesn't usually run all that fluidly, particularly if there's a lot of traffic or a snowstorm or just some lack of coordination. I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of congestion there even the last couple years on the intermodal side, sort of not having enough equipment, and not having enough space at a lot of those terminals. So it's a little bit hard to separate. Well, what's due to the merger, what's not due to the merger. In Houston, and then and then Chicago, you have the metro trains, the commuter trains, and then you have all those communities that have always been ones that have complained about railroads. I mean, Barrington, Illinois, gave a tremendous amount of pushback when CN acquired the EJ&E Railroad because they were going to run more trains on a track that was already there. So wasn't really a surprise that they got pushback there. Houston, to me that seems like that might be have a bigger impact because they've said that they're going to run more trains through Houston, so you're just going to have more volume coming through there. But it does seem like they provided an avenue for shippers to complain to sort of directly to Surface Transportation Board that circumvents the typical cumbersome process of bringing a rate case, which very few rate cases actually get brought just because the process is so time consuming, so expensive, so cumbersome that it's just not worth it. But they sort of created that. They sort of made an expedited way to do that, and it's kind of this sort of, I guess they're saying, a 7-year oversight period. What's typical is more like 5 years, and they're going to have to provide all this data, which I think is something that could have regulators might do one thing or another if they see an issue there. But the other thing that's interesting is all this concept of the gateways, which a big part of the hearings where the railroads voiced their concern, the other Class 1 railroads voiced their concerns, was related to the fact that Kansas City Southern controls the gateway right near Laredo, which is the biggest crossing by far between the U.S. and Mexico. And the concern was that if the traffic didn't, let's say U.S. traffic is going to Mexico, if it didn't originate on a CP line, let's say near Chicago, it originated on UP or BN, that they would charge an exorbitant amount for that section of the network right near Laredo, and that would be an anti-competitive measure, but it doesn't seem like they're going to be able to get away with doing that.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting, some of the tools that they've implemented. I think in terms of like what was it? There was the one with I still have to I just still have to sort of let all the details sink in, but it was the one where you mentioned the expedited hearing and for shippers in terms of if they see a rail rate increasing beyond the inflation rate to that that's some that in terms of in terms of gateways. That's it was interesting to see. I was talking to just trying to get some reactions from folks about the merger. Well, I mean about the decision, and it's interesting because it's been pointed out several times, including by Chairman Oberman, that the shippers from those I've talked to so far, they've been, I don't want to say they've been silent, but they just haven't really had an opinion one way or the other in terms of not just the merger, but also the decision itself. Obviously they're still processing everything that's in the decision, but because you have those differing points of view with some shippers supporting the merger and some those not. But then of course you have a lot of the pushback came from the railroads, which Oberman sort of remarked as well, and sort of Oberman's question, which I think he also raised on Wednesday. I was like, well, are the other class one railroads as dedicated to keeping their gateways open as well? I mean, is it? Yeah. Do we have like a two-way street here, or is it just kind of, trying to, the thing I didn't mention in the article, but I might write up in my follow-up is that, the other proposals by the railroads in terms of, CN asking for that portion of KCS's track, and then also Norfolk Southern asking sort of for more revision of the agreement between itself and KCS regarding the Meridian Speedway. It's interesting how the STB pretty much said, no, we're not going to pursue those. So that was just kind of, it was like 2 or 3 paragraphs, or maybe even just 1 paragraph, and then just went on to talk about the merger. So yeah.
Yeah, I didn't think that CN was going to be able to get that piece of the track divested. That just seemed a little aggressive to me. It seems like most others agreed. So you mentioned the shippers, most of them haven't come out and said what they thought of the opinion yet. Still digesting it. Lots to unpack there. Which of the shippers originally supported the deal and which didn't support it? Can you go back and talk about that?
Yeah, I feel like there wasn't really any, and and don't quote me on this, but I feel like there wasn't any one particular group or industry that was wholeheartedly we put our stamp of approval on this. I mean, mind you, of course, there were all those flurry of support or not support it, not in support letters submitted to the STB, a year or two ago. So I don't quite remember back then, but I want to say that it was kind of individual companies that lent their support or argued why the merger shouldn't go through. It was also confusing as well because there was a time, of course, when CN was pursuing KCS as well, and so you would have these competing releases, like, well, these people support us, and then CN would say, well, these people support us, and then just kind of go back and forth, and so it just kind of is a blur in my mind. But I feel like it was individual companies that were kind of looking at supporting or not supporting the merger, and especially if those individual companies, had a presence in Canada or Mexico, in the U.S., or just had a reason to have that more cross-border activity than maybe another company. But another thing that I thought was interesting about this whole merger was just how 3 members of the Maritime Commission, FMC, kind of voiced their concerns about how U.S. ports might be affected by the merger, and Oberman kind of addressed that as well on Wednesday, saying that he said that CP has been entrepreneurial in the way that it's pursued its business opportunities in terms of acquiring a short line in the Northeast in order to, gain access to Atlantic, Canadian Atlantic ports, and then also, it's arrangements at Vancouver with automakers, and so he was just sort of pointing his finger at the U.S. based class ones and sort of like, "Oh, what have you guys been doing lately?" I know it's like BNSF has that terminal that it's seeking to construct, and then you have the Port of Savannah having those pop up facilities, during the pandemic, but what else is there? What? So he was kind of,
Mhm.
in a way, sort of directing the class ones to step up in the plate in terms of strengthening, I guess, U.S. port interests. So
Yeah, all those things are really really interesting, and it's interesting how he draws the comparison to other railroads. I mean, the only one I remember of the shippers really coming out against this was the U.S. grain shippers that said, well, if this is going to make it easier to market Canadian grain in Mexico, because a lot of U.S. grain goes down to Mexico for Mexican
Mhm.
consumption because the U.S. growing conditions are better than Mexico. But I wonder if that argument, which is really counterproductive, because it almost makes the argument that you should approve the merger if it enhances the competition to move grain to a particular place. The STB is not, in the business of protecting, U.S. grain growers' interests. They're interested in making sure that there's enough competition on the railroad. So to me, that was kind of a bad argument. I will say one of the main takeaways for me is this really does feel like it's the last class one merger. I mean, just based on how it was evaluated, and this one might not have been evaluated if it was evaluated based on the new rules, and you still had a board member that voted against approval, and it seems unlikely that you could have another class one merger. And I even wonder if it was CN acquiring Kansas City Southern, which it appeared that it could have been, if that one would have been approved, because you do have that overlapping part of the network that goes north south. What used to be the Illinois Central. That basically goes along the Mississippi River, which in theory that could have eliminated a competitor there. But do you get the same? Do you get the same sense that this is the last class one merger?
yeah, I think so. I mean, at least if anything, for a very long time. um,
Mhm.
I think it's at least for now. Well, one, for the reasons that you brought up, but I think it's just right now. It's just not really a good environment for any class one mergers in terms of just sort of, I don't want to say public approval, but just it feels like that the sentiment now isn't for isn't for any more mergers and
Mhm.
acquisitions. I mean, the class ones. I
Mhm.
mean, the
Mhm.
short lines. It's a different story, but it's always been a different story for them. So, but yeah, I mean, definitely for now, I don't see any other mergers happening between the class one railroads.
Yeah, I agree with you there. We just have a couple minutes left. I want to bring up a sonar chart between Chicago and Dallas on domestic intermodal, which I think is an interesting one. So these are charts for domestic intermodal loaded containers. So 53-foot loaded containers. On the left is the southbound, Chicago to Dallas, which has grown nicely since 2019, from about, let's call it 300 containers a day. Now it's 379, but it was as high as 425. I think intermodal in general has been weak. It's down close to double digits, year to date. And then here on the right side, you have that northbound, which has been sort of flatter. It's gone from it's not as dense, gone from about 210 containers a day to about 232, reached a high of about 275. And this is going to be, I think, a corridor to watch with this merger. Corridor, I think we're going to watch in sonar to see, are they able to take, trucks off the road by not having them to have to interchange in Kansas City. You have one, both under one corporate umbrella. They have the control to invest, in concert, both in the southern part of the network and the northern part of the network. So this is one area that wouldn't surprise me if this were to see growth. I think right now the truck markets are probably too loose to see a lot of intermodal, domestic intermodal growth in some of these corridors that are competitive by across modes. That's typically a 2-day move on the highway, although there are truckers that do it in 1 day and do not follow the truckload rules. Once took an Uber from DFW to my house, and in that time, the driver, who also drives trucks, explained to me exactly how to cheat on the electronic logging device and explained it very clearly, even though I think he had a Russian accent. So not all truckers follow the rules, but that's one area that we hope sees intermodal volume growth. So with that as our last segment today, how can folks reach out to you, Joanna, to make sure they get your newsletter and all the rail information?
Yeah, sure. So, at the end of my articles, there's a link that says click on the newsletters, and you can subscribe to all the newsletters that FreightWaves produces. And my email is jmarsh, marsh @freightwaves.com. If anyone has any tips or grievances, happy to get them all.
Okay, great. If anyone needs me, I can be found at mbowdendistel@freightwaves.com. And hope everyone has a good day.